Okay, we're live now.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday morning. Today's meeting is special in its own way. We are having a conversation between Ramachandra Guha and Rukmini Banerjee on Ramachandra Guha's new book, Rebels Against the Raj. Ram, as most of you would know of him, most of you have read his pieces, many of you would have read his books as well, is one of India's best historians. And what is unique about his work is that he doesn't write just for the academics. It is a wider audience which is able to relate to much of his work that he has done over the past 3-4 decades. Rukmini Banerjee is, we've had Ram on Manthan a number of occasions, but this is the first time we are having Rukmini Banerjee on Manthan, and we hope she will have a separate session on her own later. She is the CEO of Pratham. Pratham, again, is an organization that most of you would have heard of and perhaps even worked with. They worked in the field of education, and she's been with Pratham for a couple of decades, not just producing their annual reports that we have seen, but worked with education at school level in different parts of the country and in a number of ways. I'll keep this introduction short. We will now have a conversation between Ram and Rukmini Banerjee on the book Rebels Against the Raj, which is really a fascinating book, which I've just completed and which I wouldn't mind pushing, as it were, on this occasion, that all of you read the book for the way it is written and for its subject. Rukmini and Ram, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. For me, it's a huge honor to be asked to be part of this conversation. And of course, many of my close friends and colleagues wanted to know why me, since it's well known that I know no history. And I'm from that generation of school education in India, where you chose arts or science in 9th standard. And from 6th to 8th, every year we would start with Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, reach up to the Gupta period, and then stop and go all the way back again. So I am deeply grateful to people like Ram for having, provided materials that fill in my very large gaps in my education. But I also feel that, Ram, your books over the last so many years have been written for people like me. I'm sure there are people who are very erudite and knowledgeable who also enjoy your books. But I think that a big piece of my own education has come from being able to read the stuff that you write, which you write in such an accessible way that absolutely ordinary people like me who have interests can relate to it. So with this, I welcome you to this conversation. And before we head into kind of my asking you a few things, I wonder if you'd like to say something.
Yeah, so thank you, Rukmini. So first of all, I'd like to say how happy and pleased and honored I am to be at Manthan again. As Ram Reddy said in his introductory remarks, I've spoken several times at Manthan. I think every previous occasion has been in Hyderabad. And I think every previous occasion has been followed by a dinner at which Vikram, often Ram, and the late Ajay Gandhi were present. So I'd like particularly to remember Ajay Gandhi, who was with Vikram, one of the founders and moving spirits of this wonderful organization, this wonderful public-spirited organization, which has no parallel anywhere else in India. I think as a city organization that hosts talks across a diversity of themes, scholars, activists, ideologies, is really about argument, debate, discussion, reflection, the enhancement of our understanding. Manthan is non-pareil. And I think Ajay, along with Vikram and their team, helped make it so. So I'd like first to remember Ajay and honor his memory. The second thing I'd like to say to the audience is don't be taken in by Dr. Banerjee's remarks, self-deprecatory remarks about herself. I think she learned self-deprecation in her years in England because the British are very good at it. She actually is a considerable scholar. She's from Delhi University. She has a Rhodes Scholarship. She has a degree in Oxford and a PhD in Chicago. So I hope that, of course, I'm delighted that I'm in conversation with her. And I'm very pleased that, she's read my books. But I think don't be taken in by her rather disarming presentation of her as some kind of, rather uneducated kind of unformed person. Thank you.
Ram, let's jump straight into the book. I know you have been asked about this book in many platforms and interviews, but I still think it's a good place because I would like to know. Two questions. One, which you do answer in your introduction, but much more in your concluding remarks, which is about the particular choice of the people in this book. But I want to just start off with, among the many things in your very wide range of interests and depth of knowledge, how did the germ of this book come to be?
So essentially, Rukmini, if we were to go back to how I became a writer of books, how I became a scholar and writer of books, I was, and you're one of the people who knows this quite well because we were contemporaries in university many years ago. When I was a university student in Delhi, I was obsessed with playing cricket. I was registered for a degree in economics, and I did a second degree in economics so that I could play 2 more years of cricket. And towards the end of my MA, I discovered that actually I was both a second-class cricketer and a second-class economist. And while I was confronted with the stark and final realization of these twin failures, purely by happenstance, I stumbled upon the works of a man called Verrier Elwin, who was an Oxford scholar who came to India to join the church, left the church, joined Gandhi, left Gandhi, and then spent 2 decades in central India, in what is now Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, writing a series of landmark ethnographic works about Adivasis. He married an Adivasi girl, became a leading spokesman for their rights in land and forests, a very sensitive analyst and documenter of their culture, their poetry, their language. And after reading Elwin, I realized that this is more to my liking. Writing about real human beings is something that I can do. I'm not very good at analyzing numbers, at decoding charts, at following economic arguments, but lives of people interest me. So I then moved to a degree in sociology. I did a PhD in sociology via Elwin, because Elwin was an anthropologist, and anthropology and sociology are closely related. And then when I was doing my PhD, which was on the history of forests in India, I found Elwin again, because Elwin had written very insightfully about colonial forest laws and how they bore down so hard on particularly our tribal people. And then, of course, I moved into historical writing. And at some stage, I decided I wanted to write a biography of Elwin, which is what I did. It was not my first book. My first book was a study of forests and peasants in the Himalaya called the Unquiet Woods, which came out in 1989. But 10 years later, my biography of Elwin appeared. And by working on Elwin's life, I realized that he was one of a cohort of many such remarkable, crazy, interesting, controversial, talented foreigners who made their home in India during the colonial period. And of course, when the British came to, when the British ruled India, particularly in the 19th century, late 19th century, after the crown took over from the East India Company, essentially you had white people in India as civil servants, as policemen, as judges, as merchants, as planters, as soldiers, and occasionally as missionaries. And I found that Elwin was part of a group of these boundary crossers, these mavericks, these renegades, as I call them. And I thought, having written on Elwin, because that was a personal obligation, I had to write about the man who changed my own life. I thought I should do a collective biography of 10 or 12 or 15 such renegades and rebels against the Raj. Now, then I got distracted in the other things, and then I wrote other kinds of books, but I kept on collecting material on these people. And then finally, I decided that I would restrict myself only to those Westerners who courted arrest or were deported at the time of the Raj. Otherwise the project will become too diffuse. If I, just yesterday, I got a mail from someone who bought my book, And it will not surprise you that his last name was like yours, Banerjee. He was from Bengal. And he said, why is Sister Nivedita not in this book now? Okay, that's a legitimate question. Other people have asked me, why is C.F. Andrews not in this book? A Malayali will ask, why is Laurie Baker not in this book? So I had to make this project manageable. And I focused it by making a distinction between what I call bridge builders, like Nivedita and Andrews and Laurie Baker, who came to kind of to immerse themselves in Indian soil, but really were not political activists to the extent of going to prison. So bridge builders versus renegades who completely identified with the freedom struggle and paid the kind of more or less the ultimate sacrifice of being incarcerated by their own racial compatriots. Right. So then over the years, a longer list was winnowed down to 7, who are the 7 who feature in this book. And then I was able to get new materials on them. And that's how the book came about. And it's been 20 years in the making, and it was really inspired by my work on Elwyn.
You know, when you describe the choices you made, of course, this going to jail is a criteria that I think is a very interesting one. But the other criteria you put out you say these are people of unusual importance. And I think the word unusual to me sort of struck. They decisively changed sides. So we know they were on a different side, but this decisively changed sides, identifying completely with India and meeting Indians on absolutely equal terms. And I'm sure as you were going through your much longer list of who you want to write about, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about these. I mean, this seems to be a very, well thought out, both strategy as well as these terms that you use, I think are quite loaded with, substance.
Actually, Rukmini, this you could say, interpretation of what bound these 7 people together, that they decisively changed sides. They met with Indians with equal terms and they had Indians as friends, lovers, comrades, life partners, came only at the end of my research for I didn't start with it, but when the more I read about the characters in this book, the more I read about Stokes or Horniman or Miraben or Spratt, this is the realization I came to. And of course, the last thing that binds them together, I mentioned several, you mentioned the fact that they were either arrested or deported, is that they all left a body of writing behind. So they all reflected on what they saw, what they understood of India, and what they felt India's problems were. So, sometimes there is a very common phenomenon in global history where you adopt a new religion and you undergo what's called a Damascene conversion. You become blind to that fault. So your new religion you're just absolutely dogmatic in your adherence to its faiths and beliefs. Or a new country, and you think, you have a whole history of what is called fellow travelers, Western leftists who go to China and say this is utopia, or to go to Russia and Cuba and think it's the perfect society. But what was remarkable of these 7 people is that while they became Indian, they wanted to become Indian, but wished to retain the right to criticize what they found problematic with India, whether it is our treatment of women, whether it is, our treatment of Dalits, whether it is our reckless attitude towards the destruction of nature, whether it is the curbs on the freedom of the press, whether it is our reluctance to criticize great leaders like Nehru and Gandhi. So I think that really was appeal to me, that that they had this independence of mind and they left behind these writings, because a biographer needs a written record. If someone lived 90 years ago, you can't be talking to their great-grandchildren about what they were doing. You need a contemporary record of their letters, their speeches, their articles, their writings. And in all these 7 cases, they were not just activists, but they were writers and interpreters as well. And I think that's what bound them together. And that's what made the telling of the story possible.
In the telling of the story through the book, I mean, the structure that you have evolved, you say that the first person arrived in India in 1893 and the last person died in 1984. It's almost it's actually a whole century of modern India. And the book is divided also into 3 sections. those who you call crossing over changing sides, which is clearly, the colonial period. Then you have a thinner section, which is sort of like as the transition is happening, and you call it seeing out the Raj. And then, of course, there are people who live well into independent India. And to me, the interesting thing was that many of your cast of characters goes across at least two, if not three, of these periods. So as you were thinking about these seven, individual lives and biographies, I'm always curious when a final book comes out as to what led to the design and the construction of how you tell the story.
So it all falls into place more or less towards the end. So you do the research, you gather material, you write it up, then you do a second round of research, you gather more material. In this case, unlike in my previous book, so I wrote a biography of Elvin, which was 1 volume. I wrote a biography of Gandhi, which is 2 volumes. Here, it was a group portrait of 7 people. So I had to interweave the lives. So one decision I had to take early on was whether to have 7 discrete sections or to interweave their lives in a chronological way. And I took the latter choice because I think that worked better. And through that interweaving, I could actually trace this very tumultuous, complicated history of India over a century. So you begin with Annie Besant's coming in 1983, and then you follow her career, and then you leave her career just when Gandhi has supplanted her as the main leader of the national movement, and then you move to the others in the story, Horniman who comes next, Stokes, and so on and so forth, and then you reintroduce Annie Besant when you describe her last years, which were rather sad and forlorn. So I think that, but then while I was writing it in this way, this threefold schema fell into place. No, not all books have to be divided into parts, but sometimes it makes a kind of makes sense. So when crossing over, changing sides, how did these foreigners become Indians? Seeing out the Raj, what were they doing when it was clear and evident that the British were on their way out? And finally, what did the five of them who lived after 1947 do after independence? And I gave that third part the title Independent Indians, meaning not just Indians who lived in independent India, but Indians who were of an independent mind, who were not abjectly deferential to whichever government was in power. So I think a lot of this really only emerges towards the end. After you've done the research, the writing, the rewriting, the book takes shape, and then you think this is the structure that best suits the narrative, and this is how you can break it up into clearly distinct parts, each of which is internally coherent.
In the storytelling, and I think that the way that you have constructed it, it really, the story of India of that time comes through the lives and the eyes and the experiences of these people. 2 more chapter headings I found very evocative or provocative, I don't know which is the right word. Mothering India and Daughtering Gandhi.
Yes, okay.
And, say a little bit more about it.
So, obviously, it's fun to play around with titles. It's fun to play around with book titles, with chapter titles. So, Mothering India is Annie Besant, who, when she comes, who is the only one of the 7 characters, Rukmini, in this book, to have had a substantial public career before she comes to India. The others come to India relatively young, in their 20s, sometimes in their 30s, and make their mark here. Annie Besant comes in her mid-40s, and by which time she has already achieved renown as a fighter for women's rights and for social equality in England. She's an associate of the great atheist MP Charles Bradlaugh, the great atheist MP and critic of British imperialism Charles Bradlaugh. She's a personal friend of such admired writers as H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw. She's written books, she's indulged in controversy, and then she embraces theosophy and comes to India. And so she has a record of public service and achievement. So she's already quite a personage when she comes here. And she's the leader of the theosophical movement. And of course, there's an aura about her as the word of what she's done in England has preceded her. So she has an enormous reputation, particularly among the English-speaking upper caste, middle-class elite of both South India and of North India, because she helped set up the Banaras Hindu University. And she has this sense that I am showing India the way. She has a kind of I would say, a proprietorial sense, attitude towards India, but certainly she sees herself as a leader. And of course, she's unmarried and she's a matriarch. She has lots of mostly younger male followers. She's known, as I say in my book, in South India, she's known as Periyamma, which is the big mother. In North India, she's known as Badi Mem Saab. Okay. So she has that kind of rather elevated sense of what she's bringing to India, which is partly justified because she's an incredibly charismatic person, very energetic, and has this decade-long record of achievement in public life behind her. So then you come to daughter Gandhi. And obviously, again, as I said, all these things fall into place while the book is being written. So after you start with Mothering India, when you come to chapter 5, and Mirabai, I think, is the fourth character in the book, it makes sense to say daughter Gandhi. Now, the thing that the situation in India has changed. The Congress no longer needs a charismatic Irish woman to lead it. It has to have its own guy, in this case Gandhi, who speaks in the vernacular, Gujarati and Hindi, rather than in English, which was Annie Besant's preferred mode of communication. By 1925, when Mirabai joins him, he is the unchallenged leader of the Indian freedom movement. He has an international reputation. And this young, confused concert pianist from England, Madeline Slade, daughter of an admiral, discovers Gandhi and comes to be his sevak. And to be his sevak, I mean, I think there is probably a full-fledged book to be written about Mirabai, and the title would be Bapu Ki Beti. I don't know, it is nicer than daughter Gandhi. And of course, later she becomes a rebellious daughter. She fights with her Bapu and so on. But this again makes sense. So it's like, the art of crafting a whole book is to try and see that that you're in conversation with the reader, of course, but also different parts of the book are in conversation with each other. So I think that's how these two titles that struck you really came about. Yeah.
So I have now several types of questions. So I'm going to just sort of, some of the people in this book, I think 5 of them are British.
Yes.
And 2 are Americans.
Yes.
Now, they come to India at different times. They are involved in different parts of India. But to what extent do you think the British and the American perspective on what is happening in India is different or similar? I mean, does the fact that they are British or American make a difference in at least in their early years when they are here?
I think it does, because the British are identified with the ruler much more explicitly. Whereas the Americans, of course, are of the same racial type. They're whites, and so hence also members of the ruling race, which at this time, the early 20th century, was dominant across the world. But they don't absolutely carry the same baggage. Both the 2 Americans, Stokes, who comes as a Quaker, and Krea, who comes as a missionary and left the church, I think have a little more freedom to operate than the British do. I think, and they actually forge very close relations with the people around them. Stokes is still revered in Himachal because of his work among the peasantry and particularly promoting apples. Krea is probably among my 7 people the most obscure to most readers. But if you travel to southern Tamil Nadu, if you go to places like Madurai and Dindigul, where is the Gandhi Gram Rural University, which he helped set up, I mean, he's still admired because these 2 people immersed themselves in the lives of ordinary people. I mean, they lived with peasants, like peasants, right? Largely like peasants. I mean, Stokes was, of course, slightly more affluent. Yes, but they would have carried less baggage for sure. And so would have Annie Besant, because she was Irish. She was 3/4 Irish. Those who were properly British, I think, firstly, there may have been some hesitation accepting them. But the flip side would have been that the British really held a grudge against them. The officials of the Raj had developed a venomous hatred towards Mirabai and Sprats both, because they were seen as disloyal, absolutely disloyal. Spratt was from Cambridge. Miraben was a admiral's daughter. So they're both part of the British establishment. And how dare they join the freedom struggle? Likewise with Honeyman. When Honeyman was deported in 1919, after the editorials he wrote on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, he had to leave Bombay and go to England. He was just picked up and put on a ship. And he kept on trying to come back to India. And while liberal British MPs were supporting him, the Bombay government, the Englishmen in Bombay in charge of running the Raj, said, we don't want this troublemaker back. So I think, so it worked both ways. On the one hand, being British meant it may be a little more difficult for you to truly win acceptance among Indians, even though you were an anti-colonial Englishman not sympathetic to the Raj. At the same time, the officials of the Raj really saw you as traitors and as someone who had betrayed their side by identifying with the other side.
In the construction of the book, you make these two. I feel these two key points, that there were rebels and there were bridge builders, and you've picked on the rebels. But among these rebels, they were not just anti-colonial crusaders, but they were nation builders at a time that I think was very fertile for all kinds of change.
Yeah.
And you just talked about Honeyman, and I think in reading that chapter, firstly, I have passed by Honeyman Circle in Bombay like a million times, and maybe once or twice wondered who this is. And so I think that he was such a, as you say, a man of unusual importance, just points to our own illiteracy about many of these things. But I think that in this nation building, the Honeyman chapter for me was very interesting because of how at that time, I mean, it makes, you quote newspapers throughout your book on so many different sources. And yet the only one on which we get into what journalists at the time did and what freedom of the press meant and what young journalists had to, face, Honeyman is probably the only one. So in your work, looking at their writings and collecting what they say, through the eyes of Honeyman and then through other things that you say, how do you connect, or what messages do you feel are coming through from that time to today's time, when I feel like there is, all kinds of things happening with the media and the press?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think Honeyman's case is very interesting because he was deported. And another friend I talked to brought up the case of Atif Tasir, who's not allowed back in India because of what he wrote, right? Now, so absolutely. So I think Honeyman was a precocious crusader for the freedom of the press. He also started a union for working journalists. So he wanted journalists to be organized. He also wanted the editor to have a say in management. Normally, the board of a newspaper does not have the editor, right? And I think, Ram Reddy would have some, as a distinguished editor of a weekly and now of India Forum, not of a newspaper, would have some interesting thoughts on this. If an editor is running a newspaper and he or she is completely responsible for its content, its shape, its staffing, should not he or she have a say in the management? Should not they be sitting in the board of director meetings? Should really be about fat cats who talk about ads and revenues and balance sheets? So Honeyman, yes, I mean, then of course you have much later Sarlaban and her pioneering work in promoting girls' education in a totally backward patriarchal part of India, the Uttarakhand Himalaya, extremely feudal, extremely patriarchal, in which girls do not go to school, they're married off early, they work in the fields, but they cannot learn to study. And she's challenging that. And of course, her work is entirely relevant to all the wonderful work that Pratham and Asar have done. Likewise with Kaitan talking about land rights. So a lot of what these people do speaks to what the unresolved problems and fault lines and tensions in Indian society today. But I'd like, essentially, these are 7 very special, very distinctive lives brought together by the common themes we talked about earlier in our discussion. All foreigners became Indians, all went to jail or were deported, all met Indians on equal terms as friends, lovers, comrades, all wrote interesting and important things. How they speak to, in what particular ways they speak to India today is for the readers to make up their mind. You picked on Hahnemann, somebody else might pick on Saralaben as being most relevant. A third person may talk about Stokes because, one of the very important questions facing economic growth in India today is, can we sustain a model of commercial agriculture which benefits peasants, where they're integrated with the market, get a fair price for their produce, and do not have to, where agriculture does not lead to destitution and mass migration out of the village. Now, Himachal Pradesh is a very interesting example because although it's a small hill state, landlocked state, through Stokes' pioneering of agro-horticulture, it's got a fairly robust agricultural economy. So I think all of them have interest, Besant, I suppose, in education, culture and education. So I wanted to leave, I do end by saying these are some of the things we can, some of the ways in which their lives, their legacies, their writings still speak to us in India today. But in what particular ways, it's for readers to make up their minds. But it's essentially these 7 very remarkable lives whose stories I've tried to tell in some sort of integrated way. I think a historian should never, a historian can analyze, narrate, interpret, but a historian should never prescribe. Aisa karo, ye karo, go to war, don't go to war, that kind of stuff. It's a problem. So, it's what you do is show this extraordinary diversity of their lives and in what ways you can actually take forward their legacies is for the readers to decide.
I was saving my favorite questions for towards the end of our conversation, after which, I know there's a lot of people in the audience who have things they want to talk to you about. So I want to come to the question of education.
Yeah.
And I see, reading through the layers of the book, I think there are many strands, but 2 that I want to pick out. 2 of our characters were involved in setting up universities. And a setting up of a university has a whole set of other, I would say, priorities behind it and philosophies. And then there are 2, you talk about Saralaben much more and maybe Stokes less, who set up schools.
Yes.
And I think both of these are very interesting phenomena. We see, one of them, Annie Besant, was involved in the setting up of one of India's premier universities.
Yeah.
So the university, the formation, the imagination of a university through the eyes of Annie Besant and I don't know how to say his name, Ketan. Sounds like Ketan, yes. What was the impetus behind it? How far were they able to go? And we'll come to the school one afterwards.
So I think there's a link. So let me answer universities and schools together or sequentially.
Okay.
So I think it's a very interesting point you make, and it only strikes me that the universities that Besant and Ketan set up were both in different ways innovative departures from models of higher education then prevalent in India. So in British India, you had the colonial universities, which were, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, set up in 1857. And then you had the Aligarh College, which was not yet a university. And the BHU was supposed to be an Indian university with Indian money, Indian ideals. Of course, maybe largely Hindu ideals, which is why it had that. So it was explicitly set up as an alternative to the colonial university, with the colonial university essentially produced lawyers and teachers and civil servants. And this was trying to do something different. Whether it succeeded is an open question. Gandhi himself, in his famous speech at BHU in 1916, said, you have to immerse yourself in the life of the peasants and, and so on and so forth. But it was supposed to be different from the colonial university. Ketan's university, which he had set up, Gandhi Graham, was the first university devoted to rural life. Again, it was in its own way an alternative to Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, which are based in the cities, servicing the modern sector, the modern professional bureaucratic sector. So I think they were both very interesting initiatives. I mean, I'm not saying either was dramatically successful and so on, but they were clearly departures from the models that exist. Likewise with the schools that Sarla Devi and Stokes set up were alternatives to government schools and missionary schools. So these were not government schools. They were self-generated by what we would call civil society, by grassroots organizations, but they were non-denominational. They were not Christian or Arya Samaj schools. You know, there was no kind of bar or there was no kind of indoctrination in a theological sense. So I mean, again, I don't want to judge as to how successful they were. I think, of course, the BHU, Besant was one promoter, Malviya was the second, and very quickly Malviya edged out Besant, and which is why she never really got the credit for being a very important co-founder of the university. I think Sarla did actually play a transformative role because, I mean, since I am from Uttarakhand and my early work was in Uttarakhand, I know how incredibly backward and patriarchal Uttarakhand, the hills of Uttarakhand were and still are. And the school she set up is absolutely the interior. You know, it's not in Nainital, which is close to the plains and where there was already a thriving modern sector. It's in Kausani, which is an interior about 9 hours drive from Nainital. And there to set up a girls' school. And many of the people she trained went on to become admired social workers and contribute in different ways to cultural, social, and public life in Uttarakhand. But yes, I mean, 4 of them were educationalists. I think quite seriously, and did quite interesting and imaginative things. Yeah.
Throughout this book, and I think in some of your other books, travel across India, constant travel across India, plays a very major role in shaping how these individuals evolve. And I am, when I look at any of them, I mean, all your characters, that at that time, traveling was a considerably more difficult task than, but it seems that this, having to see things for yourself, meet people who were, doing work, whether on the ground or in public life for yourself, all of these things, I mean, it could be lack of TV, lack of social media, but this first-hand travel plays a very important role in shaping.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've thought a lot about, what if Annie Besant had never traveled? What if Miraben just stayed in one place? Absolutely. How different would their lives have been?
Absolutely. And that's a very, very perceptive and important point, and a very contemporary point. So you have Spratt, who starts in Bombay, then goes to Calcutta to mobilize workers, is arrested, is spent 7 years in jail in UP, then comes down south. And Mira starts in Ahmedabad, goes to Sevagram in central India with Gandhi, then goes to Orissa at the time of the war and finally ends up in the Himalayas. Sarla Ben goes from Udaipur to Varda to Himalaya, and so on and so forth. And all of them really travel a great deal. Possibly with the exception of Stokes, who's largely based in Himachal. Now, I think travel is wonderful, just like every language is a window to the world. Every state of India gives you a new understanding of what India is about, which is different and of what some other state gives. And often it by talks to well-heeled, successful Indian students. For example, if I'm talking at IIM, the people who will have the money when they graduate to travel, I tell them by all means go to the West. You want to see France and Italy, Tika. But try and see, every state in India is like a large European country. I mean, and I myself, just love visiting different parts of India. There are 2 states I have not been to, Rukmini, Nagaland and Mizoram. That's it. And in 2020, I was due to visit both states in March of that year, and then the pandemic happened. And I'm still hoping, though I'm a little older now, and I'm in my mid-60s, I still want to go. And I mean, if you look at, see, again, this is slightly departing from the theme of our conversation, but again, if you reflect on my state, Karnataka. Okay, now Karnataka has at least 5 or 6 distinct ecological and cultural regimes. There's old Mysore, which is where I am, Bangalore, the kind of, the Kaveri flows through it, prosperous, irrigated. Then, of course, you go north to rather arid parts. Then you go slightly west, you come to Malnad, which is Shimoga and so on. And then you come to the crest of the Ghats, you go further west, then you come down to the coast. Or if you go east, you will come to what is called, the Bombay Carnatic, which is Dharwad and so on. If you go, northwest, you'll come to the, northeast, you'll come to, northeast, you'll come to the Hyderabad Carnatic, which is, very different, gorgeous Islamic architecture and so on. So there are about 6 states in Karnataka, probably similar in Maharashtra, in Gujarat, in Madhya Pradesh. And so I think travel is something that opens your mind. And I think the smartphone, you can't travel via smartphone. And you have to travel on the road, by train, or of course, if you're in a car, you can't travel at 35,000 feet above. So yes, I mean, I think, I think you certainly probably traveled even more than I have across this country. I mean, and I think that's something which, and you get a different perspective. I mean, I think there's a reason why Gokhale told Gandhi, you've been out of India 20 years. When you come back, don't open your mouth on public affairs for a year, just travel. There's a reason Gokhale told Gandhi that. And of course, Gandhi honored that commandment very honestly and sincerely. Yeah. And I think, again, this came to me only after I was completing the book, Rukmini, that actually, virtually, except for the Northeast, all parts of India are represented by the travels and activities and campaigns of these 7 characters. All parts of India come. You get an understanding of a very different geographical, cultural, political configurations across India. No one really goes to the Northeast. I mean, unlike Elvin, who actually spent many years in Arunachal and Assam and Nagaland. Yeah, so I think that's true. I mean, that's true that it's very appealing. It's not just that they leave England, travel from England to come to India. They travel across India, all through their lives. And I think that's what's so nice about them.
I mean, this is a topic for a different conversation about how biographers in the 21st century are going to write when all important things are happening on WhatsApps or other things. And maybe they will not chronicle fast travel across the country, but that's not the topic of today's conversation. I just want to end with your ending, your epilogue, in which you do mention 4 other people. And I wondered if that was, is that an afterthought? Is that a signal that maybe there is going to be a Rebel 2.0 coming up, a book? But you do mention 4 people, a couple and 2 others. Yeah. And I just was curious about why at the end of the book do you say, oh, by the way, there are some other people?
Yeah, so, every work of history is a conversation, is taking part in a conversation, is taking our previous understanding further, but leaving things unfinished for other historians and biographers to take further still. And these 4 people are Frida Bedi, who fell in love with an Indian classmate called BPL Bedi, an Indian friend at Oxford, and then came out to India and worked, and then of course was a left-wing communist, worked with Sheikh Abdullah, and later on became a Buddhist and very close to the Karmapa, one of the major representatives of Tibetan Buddhism. She was one. Then there is Nellie Sengupta, who again was an English woman who fell in love with an Indian student, J.M. Sengupta, came to Calcutta, and when her husband was in jail, was briefly president of the Congress for a few months, and then ended up in East Bengal, what then became East Pakistan. And a couple, James and Margaret cousins, who were Irish radicals, already active in public work in Ireland and England, and admirers of Annie Besant, and came to join her in Madras and stayed on here. James' cousin wrote many books on culture, art, spirituality. He was a principal of a college, and Margaret Cousins played an important role in founding the All India Women's Conference and actually mentoring such remarkable Indian feminists as Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. So now these 4, what distinguishes these 4 from my 7 is that they came to India not alone. Frida Bedi fell in love with an Indian and followed him. Nellie Sengupta fell in love with the Indian, followed him, and Margaret and James Cousins came together to join Annie Besant. So in that sense, there's a distinction, but of course, they deserve their full biographical treatment. Frida Bedi has been the subject of a good book by the British writer and historian Andrew Whitehead, who was the BBC correspondent in India for some years and has written a decent book on Frida Bedi, which I mentioned in the footnotes. I think Nellie Sengupta, because of course she spent many years in East Pakistan. That would be interesting to talk about her. Her husband died quite young, and the cousins were a remarkable couple. I think they would also deserve probably a long biographical essay, if not a whole book. So, this book is already quite long. And the question was, what new stuff can I find on those 4 other people? And there was this distinction, Rukmini, that those 4 people who figure in my epilogue did not come alone. The 7 I feature all came alone of their own volition, not because they were in love with an Indian. I think that's something which I felt made sense made sense that I would give them an honorable mention and tell the reader about these 4 quite impressive people. They would not be part of the main narrative.
Yeah. Let me now hand over to Vikram, because I think there may be lots of people who want to have their questions addressed to you.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Rukmini, for that conversation on a fascinating aspect of India's freedom movement. And I must recommend this book to all of us who are now watching this and more. It's so well captured by Ram, and it's an insightful conversation. Thank you, Rukmini, for guiding us through the book. I just wanted to quote a quote from the book by Annie Besant, which reflects so much of Manthan. Annie Besant wrote in 1914, if I remember right, and I'm quoting from the book, to hold a free platform for the expression of varied opinions of religion, educational, and political problems, so that the burning questions in all parts of the world may be thrashed out and truth elicited by thoughtful discussion. Some of this is exactly what we believe in Manthan, and I'm not surprised that Annie Besant said it 108 years ago. Thank you, Ram, for pointing out that platform. Personally, I thank you for the generous praise, and it's only Ajay's spirit that drives all our members in our advisory board to take it forward. Now, I just want to ask you the first question. It says that, what do you think that we have to learn from the lives of these 7 people whom we have highlighted? Is it fearlessness, courage, liberalism, Western ideas? What do you think we have to learn from them?
I think broadly what we have to learn is that it's a mistake to shut yourself off from the world. What individual lessons each of these characters hold for us, I won't get into. I've already said in my conversation with Rukmini, I don't want to give specific recommendations. But xenophobia is bad for a culture or a country. And that's not just true of India. Xenophobia is sweeping the world. Whether it is Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers, Donald Trump and the white supremacists, Xi Jinping and his idea that China is destined to rule the world, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey. Many cultures are consumed by this dogmatic belief that the rest of the world has nothing to teach them, right? And I think these 7 lives tell us that, open-minded engagement with so-called foreign ideas, foreign thinkers, foreign scholars, foreign activists actually can help us see ourselves in a much clearer light. So I think that's the broad, I suppose, lesson or takeaway from this book, beyond, of course, those 7 lives.
Ram, can I moderate a question from the audience? I don't know how accurate this is, but the questioner says, it is said that Annie Besant endorsed and extolled the caste system of the land as the best social structure the world has ever had.
Yeah.
Is there any truth to this?
There is some truth to it, and I talk about it in my book. So she had a kind of Hindu view of Indian civilization, though she did recognize discrimination against untouchables, she was not absolutely forthright in his denunciation. And most of her followers were Brahmins. And I talk in my book about some very polemical attacks on Annie Besant by leaders of the Justice Party. So she had, I would not say she was casteist, but she was somewhat conservative. This could have come in part from a sense that I'm an outsider. Do I need to take this hands-on? There's an old debate on this question captured in an article which maybe even you published in when you were in the editor of the EPW by Rajmohan Gandhi called Independence versus Social Justice. I think it must have been when you remember that article, right?
Yeah.
So there's a debate going on in the late 19th and early 20th century. Should we fight for India's independence from British rule first, or should we fight for the elimination of inequality and discrimination within Indian society first? Now, Gandhi was someone who tried to do both together, but Tilak took one route and Gokhale took the other route. But she did have a kind of a classically Hindu view of the world, but it's interesting. What is interesting, again, if you go back to my book, you see it. She made a distinction. She made a distinction which is relevant in the present context. She made a distinction between the Muslim rulers of India and the British rulers of India. She said the Muslim rulers of India stayed on in India and became Indian. And of course, there was a blending of Hindu art, Hindu music, Muslim music, but they stayed on and became Indian, whereas the British took their wealth and departed. They went back and built themselves large mansions. So not all of what she says would be comfortable to a kind of a current, Hindutva view of the world. But yes, I mean, it is true that she saw Indian civilization largely in Hindu terms. It is also true, as I talk about my book, that the people attracted to her were usually Brahmins. Most of her, the chaps who followed her. And I quote actually some rather sharp criticisms that a newspaper editor called Nair, who was the leader of the Justice Party, made about her. Yeah. None of these people were flawless. I mean, they all had all kinds of, angularities.
Ram, in one section of the book where you talk about independent Indians, the question I have is, why did they not join the government? Were they already disillusioned at the time?
No, I think it's always a problem. If you're a free spirit, it's a problem working with government. There were others who worked with the government. For example, again, who were kind of bridge builders. There's a very interesting man whom some of your audience may have heard of called Penderel Moon. I should tell you a little bit about Penderel Moon. He was a fascinating man. He was an ICS officer and a scholar. And he was a very close friend of Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, who was one of Gandhi's closest associates. When the 42 movement happened, so Moon was in the Punjab cadre of the ICS. And when the 42 movement happened, he carried on corresponding with his friend in jail. And his superiors chastised him, so he resigned from the ICS and went back to England, came back later, worked in the transfer of power, was in the planning commission. Nehru even sent him as chief commissioner to Manipur in the early 50s. And Moon wrote some really important books. His book, Divide and Quit, is a first-class account of partition. He also wrote a very good analysis of Gandhi. So he was a kind of a bridge builder, so I was quite comfortable working with the government. Some British ICS officers also stayed on and worked with the government. But I think these chaps and not these chaps, these women too, were really, in that sense, out. They could not be captured by the state. They could not be captured by the British state or indeed by the Indian state, and I should, so I think that's rather, at least certainly makes them appealing to me. Yeah.
There's a question from Padmanabh, very interesting question from the lens of today. He asks, wasn't the Raj distinctly more tolerant through whatever lens one peeks through? Imagine those 7 traveling now and penning their thoughts. Can we?
Well, I would not say so. I mean, I would not say the Raj was particularly tolerant, but certainly there is growing intolerance now towards independent criticism, activism, and so on. Yeah, I'd say this though. I'd say as colonialists, the British, if you look at them compared to the other European colonialists of the time, the Raj was more tolerant than the French in Vietnam and Algeria, or the Dutch in Indonesia, or the Germans in East Africa, right? So I think in that sense, yes, that and you could always use their arguments against them, that you stand for freedom and justice and liberty at home, why not abroad? So that ambivalence is possible, and of course Gandhi exploited that. Gandhi and the freedom movement exploited that tension quite adroitly. But I don't think, I mean, it will be excessively nostalgic to think Indians were freer now than they were then. To go back to education, I mean, our rates of literacy were abysmal. The Raj did nothing about primary education, nothing about nurturing, Indian institutions and so on. So let's not take nostalgia too far.
The question I have is, I'm talking about what Stokes wrote about the imperialist forces and having to choose between British government and the German government. Do you think that in that context, and especially now that we are hero worshipping Bose right now, do you think Bose made a mistake?
So I'd say I should just explain to the reader the fuller context of what Vikram mentioned. So Stokes was, we've spoken about him. He was an American who became a Himachali, married a local girl, worked with Gandhi. And in 1924, after going to jail, he left the Congress to concentrate on social work, education, and other such stuff. In 1939, 15 years later, after not being in touch with Gandhi, he writes Gandhi a brilliant letter in March of 1939. And he says, a war is coming in Europe. It's coming. And there are two forces that are going to fight it, the British and the Germans. The British are imperialists, but the Germans are far worse. They're the most brutal, horrific, cruel people who have ever become imperialists. And if you think India's fate under the British is bad, if it comes under the heel of the Germans, it will be far, far, far worse. So he told Gandhi in March of 1939, set aside your doctrinal commitment to nonviolence and support the British. And he says, and he goes on to say, Stokes, that this war will be a long drawn out one. It'll last, he's writing in March 1939, and he's predicting it will be long drawn out. It exact enormous cost in human life and suffering. When it finally ends, if the British win, they will be so exhausted that they will leave India. If the Germans win, God help us Indians living under Hitler and the Nazis. So it's an incredibly prescient, statement of the choice. And Gandhi was kind of prevaricated because of non-violence. He didn't take side. Nehru wanted to take that side. Nehru actually wanted to support the British against the Germans, because Nehru had traveled in Germany in 1935-36. At the time his wife was dying. Nehru had also gone to China and seen the brutalities that the Japanese had wreaked on the Chinese. So Nehru was clear that however bad the British and the French were, the Germans and the Japanese were far, far worse. So I think it's an extraordinary letter that Stokes writes. Absolutely. I mean, there is no question that Bose was naive or misguided in thinking these were my enemies, my friend. I mean, the Nazis and Japan, their brutality exceeded the brutality of the British and the French by orders and orders of magnitude. And that letter of Stokes, actually, that is why I quoted it as such length, Vikram, because it's such an extraordinary letter that I had to, really use his own words. As he predicted, if the British won the war, they would be exhausted, it would leave anyway. I mean, just think of what would have happened to India if he had come under the Japanese yoke or the German yoke. I mean, just study, read about the rape of Nanking, read about what the Germans even did in Eastern Europe, let alone to the Jews, and you get a sense of how wise Stokes was in recognizing that however bad the British were, the Germans and the Japanese were far, far worse.
Ram, can I ask a question? I mean, you write about the 6 people, and Rukmini has mentioned is 4 that you mentioned in your epilogue. Could I ask, are there many more, or should there have been many more who came to India and embraced India? I ask because, in the 1910s, 20s, there was a kind of spirit of idealism in Europe, especially in England, among the young. Later, many of them went to Spain. Some of them, of course, were raptured by the Soviet Union. You would think that many more would have made the journey to India with the nationalist movement after Jallianwala Bagh. Are there many untold stories out there, or was it really a small number who?
So again, there probably are a few more untold stories, which younger historians and more energetic historians and biographers will have to discover. But I'd say, in response to your question, that there was what happened after the end of the First World War and Jallianwala Bagh and the rise of Gandhi was a groundswell of support for Indian independence in England itself. So there were some really remarkable English people, writers like H.N. Brailsford and Fenner Brockway, Labour Party politicians like George Lansbury, and quite a few others who are absolutely campaigning tirelessly for Indian independence, who are reminding British people living in England, reminding the British of their duty, their conscience. And I think that played a very important role in shifting the needle. I think the Labour Party was committed to Indian independence from the 1920s. And one of the reasons India got independence when it did, apart from the British being exhausted, is that Labour came to power in 1945 and Attlee became Prime Minister. And of course, if Churchill had come to power, he would have tried to delay independence longer. And Labour could draw on decades of campaigning for India. So journals like the New Statesman, were actively campaigning through the 30s, 20s and 30s, and writing in very critical terms about British perfidy in India. So I think there was a lot of, I would say in that sense, there was a lot of feeling and sentiment. It did not have to be expressed by giving up your life, giving up your family, giving up your career and going a million miles away to a new country, which is what the people in my book did. But there were these idealistic anti-colonialists in England who were very active in the 20s and 30s, whose role must not be discounted. I think, again, I don't believe that you had a similar cohort of anti-colonial Frenchmen in the 20s and 30s campaigning for Vietnamese or Algerian independence. I don't think that was there. I think I'm open to correction. But I think that's how, so maybe only, but having said that, there are probably a few more people. I think the cousins particularly, Margaret and James Cousins, I think deserve a joint biography. I think that's something, because they were quite, they came in, I think, in 1915, and they lived into the 1950s. So they had 40 years of activism in India. They trained all kinds of people who went on to contribute to Indian public life. And they lived in South India between Madras and Madanapalli. And their papers must be there. So, yeah, sure. There are some people, surely, whom I would have missed out. Yeah.
There's a question from Ashay. He says, what were the Labour Party's views on these rebels? Assuming that they were sympathetic towards the Indian cause and considering the fact that Tilak met them when they were in England.
I've kind of answered that. Broadly, the Labour Party was sympathetic to Indian independence. But in the 1920s, they were a rising force. They were part of a minority government. They never, could really decisively. They could only decisively shape the course of British government policy only from 1945 onwards. But before Tilak goes to England in 1909, I found a letter written in the archives, which I've not quoted in this book because it's not relevant, written by Krea Hardy, the great leader of the Labour Party, to Tilak in 1908 or 1909, saying India must be free of the British yoke. So yes, I think the role of the Labour Party was important, salutary, and significant.
There's a question on Spratt. Actually, you covered it in the book, but maybe you could convey a sense of it to this person. He or she asked, what could have caused Spratt's move away from communism after he was released from prison? He adopted ideas similar to that of a free market liberal.
Yeah. So Spratt's journey from left to right is gradual. So he comes as a young communist. He's converted to communism as a student in Cambridge, and then he really begins to read Gandhi. And probably the more he travels across India, he realizes how difficult it would be to actually accomplish a full-fledged revolution of the Bolshevik model. But he starts reading Gandhi. He's gradually cured partly of Marxism, And then he meets M.N. Roy, the great revolutionary, who had also abandoned communism and become a kind of a social democrat. And then after independence, he moves further right and becomes a free market liberal. People change their minds. I think some of what Sprats wrote in later years was important. I think his critique of the license permit quota Raj was important. On the other hand, I don't think it's either a mistake for him to have gone so far as to support the American intervention in Vietnam. But, I think the life of a person who's changing their minds as they experience new things is actually much more interesting to a biographer than someone who converts to a creed at 20 and thinks the same thing when he or she is 80. And of course, Pratt's life is very interesting also because of his personal relationship. He falls in love with a Tamil girl, and I was very, very fortunate that the family gave me access to their correspondence. And his letters to his wife are incredibly tender and moving. So, again, this is an incredibly radical act, to marry across the racial boundaries at that time. So, all these characters kind of in different ways change their minds, and that's what makes it interesting. Ideological consistency makes somebody's life boring. So, I think you want people to change a biographer wants their subjects to change their minds.
Sandeep asks two questions. One, both related to each other. One is, what kind of treatment did these 7 other foreigners who participated in the Indian independence struggle face back home? And did they actually come to India because of the mobilization the Indian leaders did?
So they came on their own. I think I'll answer both questions. So, Sarla Devi, Stokes, Ketan, to some extent Horniman, came to India and never thought about England. Annie Besant retained her contacts with the Labour Party. She kept going back and forth. She was always going to international meetings. And broadly, they would have got a sympathetic reaction among the Labour Party, but not among the Conservatives. Did Indian leaders ever, the second question is an important one. Did Indian leaders ever actively propagate the Indian agenda internationally? And did this play any role in global participation in Indian struggle? Absolutely. I think there are two very important figures here. One is Krishna Menon, who started the India League in India, in London, and worked tirelessly publicizing the Indian cause among white people, and has been written about in several biographies, most recently in a book by Jairam Ramesh. And the other, not so well known, is a very unusual man called J.J. Singh, who was a Sardar, a Sikh entrepreneur in America, who started an organization called the India League and worked there for many years, promoting the Indian cause. After independence, J.J. Singh came back to India, lived in India, became a close friend of Jayaprakash Narayan, tried very hard but unavailingly to give dignity and autonomy to the Kashmiris in the 60s and 70s, and had 2 children, one of whom was in college with me, both of whom were in college with me, and one of whom has a daughter, a grandchild of J.J. Singh, was the special assistant to Kamala Harris. I think her name is Sabrina Singh, and she's now in the White House writing speeches for an Indian American lady, writing speeches for Kamala Harris, 80 years after her grandfather was campaigning for Indian freedom in the US. So J.J. Singh's story is much less known. Krishna Menon's work on behalf of Indian independence in the UK, people have written about, but I wish someone would write about J.J. Singh and how he catalyzed American public opinion in the 30s and 40s.
Ram, I have another question. You've written about these 6 people who came before independence. 3-4 of them stayed on after independence. What about one person who you have written about who came after independence? I'm talking about JBS Haldane. He came, of course, his reasons, you have written about him, the reasons for why he came to India and became an Indian citizen are different. How would you compare the two? Very broadly.
So I did not include him because he came. I thought of including him, and I've been fascinated with him for a very long time, Ram, as you rightly say. But I finally didn't include him because I thought it would disturb the structure of the book. If I had 7 people who came before independence and 1 who came later, it's not the same thing as changing your passport in 1957 as it was going to jail in 1927 or whatever, right? So I didn't include him, but as you would have noticed, and as Rukmini would have noticed, the book is dedicated to Jean Drèze, right? So there's probably a companion volume to be written about people like Jean Drèze, JBS Holden, Gay Romwitt, and other such foreigners who came to India after independence and became activists or intellectuals or nation builders. And that's why it's important for us to remain open. I think the kind of paranoia and xenophobia we now face and the strict curbs on all kinds of activity with anyone abroad, is really and it's bad for us in the long term. I think, again, I'd say something more broadly. I think what these 7 foreigners did in India was largely because of who they were. But it was partly enabled by the attitude, the open-minded engagement with the rest of the world that people like Gandhi and Tagore practiced. My 2 epigraphs are from Gandhi and Tagore, which talks about they're welcoming ideas from everywhere, welcoming people from everywhere if they have things to contribute to India. And I think that's something which obviously, encouraged these 7 rebels, that the leaders of the Indian national movement at the time were not xenophobes.
No, but how did the fellow congressmen or the congresswomen see them? Of course, Annie Besant did become the president of Indian National Congress, but the others, were they more personal involvement or were they part of the Congress movement?
So Miraben was part of the Congress. She went to jail several times. The others, Horniman was sympathetic to the Congress. Spratt was a communist. Stokes was partly sympathetic. So they were only, out of the 7, only 2 were really truly part of the Congress. But all of them had an engagement with Gandhi, independent of the Congress. All of them, I think, were enchanted, intrigued, fascinated, sometimes frustrated by what Gandhi stood for. And in that sense, among the things that unites them is that all 7 had their own kind of accounts to settle with Gandhi. Because he was the preeminent public figure of the day. You had to respond to him. You had to engage with him. You had to deal with him.
Yeah. Ram. You're muted, Ram.
I was going to ask if Rukmini would like to ask a couple of closing questions.
So as I've been thoroughly enjoying this conversation, truly a Manthan. And I was trying to imagine another Manthan, which probably Vikram, you or Ram cannot organize. That I'm imagining a conversation over this book between Ram and Gandhi and Nehru, and wondering what they would say to Ram if they had read the book or skimmed through the book.
No, first I want to interrupt. It will be Ram, Gandhi, but Nehru won't be there. No, I don't want to take a chance.
Okay.
All right.
As organizers of Manthan, you can decide who can be in Manthan.
No, I think it would be nicer if if there was Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, and Ambedkar all. And I would love to have their thoughts on their lives. It would be interesting. Sure. Yeah. I would not exclude Nehru, unlike Vikram, but I would add it. I would add more people. I would add more people.
No, I was just joking.
I understand.
Yeah. There's one question here. It said that Rudyard Kipling supported General Dyer and motivated the British public to contribute a fund for the general. Did the British citizenry truly sympathize with our struggle? Was there any turning point?
So that was a turning point. I think 1919 was a turning point. It polarized opinion. Your questioner is right. There was a public fund for General Dyer because he was dismissed and he had to, he was in shame. But Churchill, to his credit, opposed General Dyer. Churchill later on is known as an arch-imperialist. So people were divided. But this was a turning point. I think Jallianwala Bagh, instinctively, you would defend what happened. That often the default action of a state is to defend a barbaric action when it just occurs because you have to defend your side, your official, your general. Later on, you may, that what the Americans would have done in Vietnam, that's what the Soviets would have done in Afghanistan. Later on, you realize it's a mistake. And of course, quite soon it became clear that it was a mistake. Horrible himself contributed to this growing awakeness in Britain that Jallianwala Bagh was an awful thing. He was deported in 1990 because of the articles he carried in the Bombay Chronicle on the massacre. The next year in England, he published a book called Amritsar and Our Duty to India. So following Amritsar, the duty of the British to India was to gradually transfer self-government to Indians. So it was a turning point. I mean, there's no question. Tagore returned his knighthood and many other things happened. And yes, there was sympathy for the general. Some people saw him as a scapegoat. Some saw him as restoring order. But British public opinion began to shift all through the 1920s.
Yeah. Thank you, Ram. It's been a fascinating talk. That's my view. And, and also suggest to viewers to read the book. I personally was fascinated for 1 week, poured through the book. Vikram, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ram. Thank you, Rukmini, for being with us. And very soon we'll be having an in-person meeting, our first one where Manthan has not been before in the last 2 years. We planned one in January, but again, the third wave prevented that. And on March 4th, we are having one on Russia and Ukraine by Venkatesh Verma. And I invite all of you to come in person at Hyderabad. I mean, this is something which we have started, we restarted because this is what Manthan is all about. I must thank Ram and Rukmini for being with us. Thank you, listeners, for all of you for participating in this fascinating conversation. And like Ram Manohar said, this is a book you must read. And some of the conversations were, thank you again, Ram, for taking through this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you.
Yeah. And viewers, the book is available on Amazon. So it's on a link on the Manthan website. So if you'd like to purchase the book, please do so. Yeah. Thank you, Rukmini. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.